Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending. Again, as been mentioned, my name is Ryan Wallace. I direct the Maine Center for Business and Economic Research at the University of Southern Maine, and I was planning to talk to you today about our evaluation that we did on the macroeconomic benefits of the NECEC on the Maine economy back in 2017. So just a quick background on CBER for those that aren't familiar. CBER has been around for over 40 years at the University of Southern Maine, and our core mission is to provide independent applied research, technical assistance to organizations in the state to promote or to help inform community, economic, and workforce development decision-making across the state. We do that by providing a variety of different services, one of which our core services around economic modeling expertise, and we work with quite a diverse array of stakeholders and partners across the state. So therefore, our independence is quite important. That being said, I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that our analysis that we conducted in 2017 was sponsored by Avangrid and CMP as part of their bid into the Massachusetts Clean Energy RFP. So I wanted to talk to you today focused on the analysis that we did, again, back in 2017. I believe a public version of the report is provided on this organization's website for your reference, but I'll briefly just touch on sort of the context and the analytical approach that we took, myself as sort of the primary author on this, and my colleague, Dr. Charlie Colgan, who also helped out. I'll then just overview the estimated impacts in Maine, the economic benefits in Maine, and then just kind of close up with putting some current context on this, especially in a post-COVID world. Certainly a lot of things have changed over the last few years, and just to see what this might mean for the future. Background on the NECEC, I suspect most folks are familiar with it, but just some context for the impetus behind our analysis and where that came from. The NECEC was proposed in response to Massachusetts 83D solicitation, an act to promote energy diversity, expressing a preference for Canadian hydro, where this, the NECEC line, high voltage DC current line, DC line, bringing Canadian hydroelectric down to Massachusetts and New England customers and the New England grid. It's a pretty sizable project investment in the region. As part of the bid requirements, Avangrid CMP had commissioned CBER to support the requirements to help demonstrate the macroeconomic benefits associated with the project in New England, Massachusetts, New England wide. That analysis was adapted for the Maine Public Utilities Commission's permitting certificate proceedings from the 2017 study that we did. So under both the Massachusetts bid for 83D, the proposal process, as well as the Maine PUC permitting process, required to demonstrate what the economic impacts or benefits were, phrased benefits for the Mass bid, during the development and operations of the NECEC, or whatever project it was. We were specifically asked to look at two core components. Again, what are the impacts of the project during the development and construction of the NECEC? And then the second piece was focused on what are the impacts during the operational period of the project. So any significant project like this, when you have a capital investment, usually there are some positive benefits. Certainly there could be negative benefits, but the benefits that arise economically from large infrastructure investments and spending in a region typically help support jobs, wages, as well as increased value creation and overall economic activity. So this component of our project, or excuse me, our analysis, It was focused on the expenditures to engineer, design, develop the project. So those expenditures made during that period. And then, of course, the construction of the actual line and what those anticipated benefits might look like. This analysis focused only on the spending of the NECEC that is sourced from Maine suppliers and Maine companies that would use Maine labor involved in this project. So with a project like this, a transmission infrastructure project, you're going to have a lot of components that aren't necessarily manufactured in Maine or imported into the state. Those components were not included in our estimations of the impacts. We only focused and did our best to focus on only those expenditures expected to be made in Maine. That data that came from the planned expenditures was sourced and provided by Avangrid and CMP, largely based on past projects. The Maine Power Reliability Project being one of the sources for it, as well as several others. This was done over a pretty short window in response to the bid in 2017. So we didn't have super specific information on things like average wages for different for different pieces of the project and things like that. That would be great to have, but nonetheless, we had enough to do the analysis and run it through our model. When we talk about economic impacts, you probably often hear that there are direct impacts, which can be thought of as those stemming from the initial actual expenditure, or if it's an analysis of say a manufacturing plant, the jobs and economic activity that occur at that plant. And then there are supply chain impacts. So businesses, contractors on the job for the NECEC will source different materials from supply chains. That spending supports jobs, and of course those businesses then make other sorts of spending at other businesses and other employment in the state. And then we have the local consumption effects, or what we refer to often as induced effects, where people go out, workers that are supported go out and spend their wages in the local economy on things like restaurants, or at least we did before, a lot more before COVID, but restaurants and other sorts of things like that. So the second component was focused on impacts during NECEC operations. And those primarily come from the price suppression impacts from injecting the hydroelectric energy into the New England grid, although it's primarily going to Massachusetts ratepayers. That overall price suppression happens across the grid, and therefore Maine ratepayers would benefit from that as well. So the price suppression impacts were not something that we directly estimated. Those were estimated by an energy market modeling firm called Daymark Energy Advisors, based in Portland. And they also supported other work on the NECEC project, looking at overall electricity benefits. But that data was provided to us, looking at the overall change in wholesale overall savings in wholesale energy costs to Maine ratepayers, looking across three of the four core energy sectors. We looked at residential, the commercial sector, as well as the industrial sector, ignoring the transportation sector because of the small usage. But you can think of how those impacts might be induced is a business in the commercial or industrial side, a reduction in electricity or energy costs, which we often hear are a big driver of economic development. Reduction would enable them to make more investments with that cost savings, hire more workers, or just to overall be more competitive in the marketplace. Residential ratepayers would benefit by an increase in disposable income from lower electricity costs across the whole pool of residential users, and that extra money would be reallocated to other parts of the local economy. We also had some impacts during operations from operations and maintenance of the transmission line, so jobs that go to support the maintenance of the line. And there's also municipal property tax revenues or the additional valuation to host communities that are host to the various infrastructures of the NECEC. And to look at this, to model these impacts, we use an economic model that we maintain at CBER, but we also procured a second one for the New England, for all 6 New England states, to look at ratepayer suppression across New England. The models were developed by Regional Economic Models Incorporated out of Amherst, Massachusetts. For more information, I encourage you to go on their website. But they're a very well-respected modeling firm, highly utilized in these types of analyses and similar projects across the country. Just very briefly, the scope of our analysis did not call for looking at other sources of impacts, most notably, things related that have been brought up a lot on this project, tourism related, those impacts related to other, increase or decrease in amenities, from things like reduced CO2 to impacts on visual aesthetics and things like that. We also did not directly look at state and local tax revenues that would be generated through sales, income from additional wages, either during construction development or operations. And of course, with any modeling process, this looks over a 20-year period. We were asked to look at the further out you get, the more uncertainty is built in, but even over the short term, I don't think certainly in 2017, we saw the impact coming up of a global pandemic. So the impacts, it's probably a summary of those. There's more detail in the report if you'd like to refer to it. But let me call your attention to the highlighted blue box, which shows both total and the annual average over the development and construction period. Excuse me, these jobs can be thought of as job years. So where it's not necessarily 4,453 jobs in construction created, over the period, those can be thought of as 4,400 job years supported through the project. The jobs were estimated across a few core industry categories for respective to the detail that we had in the data, the spending data. So on construction, which should speak for itself, but then on the professional technical service side, you had engineering, environmental studies and things like that, and then the management of the project overall, all had excuse me, some degree of impact. You had the direct jobs on average during this period of about 868, where those jobs would then, and the other activity would then support another average of 820 some odd jobs indirectly or through induced means over that project period. Obviously, this project timeline has shifted a little bit, pushing out, but this is all coming from the work that we did in the 2017 report. Jobs will, during development and construction, will certainly peak during the core years of the investments when construction is in its peak. That's where we expect to see the biggest impact on jobs during this period. You do see a bit of a dip back in the end year of the forecast. It's just noting that it's the economy sort of rebalancing. The model accounts for the economy sort of rebalancing itself back into equilibrium. So there is a slight dip, but that does come back up to equilibrium. You also have some impacts that we measured that look at GDP, an overall macro measure of economic activity, and then on compensation, which is inclusive of wages paid to workers. And so those are fairly sizable for the size of the investment that went into Maine spending. Again, we're focused only on Maine spending, not the overall capital investment of the project in Maine. During operations, where, as I mentioned, most of the impacts are going to be sourced through price suppression impacts to ratepayers, we see those fairly sizable. in the early years of the forecast period, and then those start to dip off as we get further out for various reasons. Excuse me, part in which there's a lot of uncertainty out in the future years, as I mentioned, but nonetheless, if we look at the averages over the period, we've got 5-year averages here for the forecast period, and then the furthest right-hand column that's darker gray, 2023 to 2042 is the 20-year forecast period. Over the entire forecast period, the model's estimating an average of 237 jobs supported through primarily price suppression impacts, but then also there's some in there from operations and maintenance as well. They're all similarly to construction development. They're going to have some impacts during to the GDP over the period as well. That just gives you a sense of what those look like. But as I mentioned, all of these estimates go back to when we were doing work in 2017. So pre-COVID, we had been ramping up on a hot string of employment growth, the longest string of employment growth, historic low unemployment in Maine. And then once COVID hit, we're jumping to some of the highest rates of unemployment that we've had. And although we expect that to start to come down as things start to open back up, I think there's certainly growing concern nationally, but how that might then affect us here in Maine, how long COVID kind of hangs around, how well we're able to manage that, and how that impact will translate onto the economy. The Boston Fed recently put out a study that estimates Maine's tax revenue shortfalls, depending on different scenarios of unemployment, could range from 193 to 300 million below 2019 levels in 2020. The number's a little lower looking into 2021, but it's still a pretty significant projection of shortfall. Obviously, some municipalities that are tourism dependent or retail dependent are going to be hit pretty hard. We've already heard some of those stories out there, and there's a lot of anxiety around that. That's ultimately, I think we're going to see some increased burdens on local taxpayers or a reduction in services, unless we can find other ways to supplement those fiscal impacts. In 2017, we looked at the property tax revenues or the potential revenues of the NECEC investments on its host communities based on 2016 mill rates. And we did not assume off the top significant depreciation of the line, so there's that to think about as well. But based on 2016 mill rates, we estimated about 18.4 million in potential municipal tax revenues starting in the base year. Of course, it's up to the municipality how they choose to absorb that additional valuation. If they do all take it as pure tax revenue, that's what the estimate comes out to, about 8.4. They can also choose to adjust their mill rate and give taxpayer relief to residents, local taxpayers, if they choose. Nonetheless, municipal tax rates, mill rates have been going up for most places over the last 10 to 15 years, and certainly expect there to be some uptick continuing as we go forward here following COVID. So, just to wrap up, from an economic stimulus perspective, the NECEC, these investments certainly, as a project moves forward, represent a pretty ideal time to be made. There's significant investments and offer some pretty significant fiscal support to communities. The Maine-based spending for the projects over $500 million per year, which is on par with an annual lobster industry in the state. So it's pretty big. Starting right at the recovery of COVID-19, hopefully it starts sooner, but assuming 2021, that would be another time when construction ramps up, and there'll be pretty big shot in the arm for investment to help counter some of these fiscal impacts, mill rate increases, sales tax revenues, and things like that. And then there's also the recently announced settlement package and commitments between Hydro-Quebec and the state of Maine for reduced rate power, which we have not necessarily looked at yet, but those are other factors. By no way am I suggesting that these are the only things that should make a decision on this project, but certainly the timing of things are pretty nice for this type of investment going in. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions when Ben gives the cue. But thanks for your attention.